Imagine a medieval pope, but she's a woman, and her followers ordained female cardinals. Picture noblewomen, draped in fine fabrics, gathering not just for courtly dances, but for clandestine meetings where forbidden knowledge was shared. Some healers, the women who knew the secrets of herbs and childbirth, faced accusations of belonging to ancient hidden sisterhoods, their practices deemed dangerous by those in power. These weren't just fairy tales. These were the whispers, the fears, and sometimes the documented realities of women who dared to step outside the lines in a world not built for them. Number 5. The Gulielmides and their female pope. Imagine this. It's Milan, late 13th century. A bustling city, full of merchants, artisans, and a whole lot of religious fervor. Now picture a group of people, men and women, gathering in secret, their hearts full of a belief so radical it could get them burned at the stake. And at the center of it all, the memory of a woman named Guglielma of Bohemia. Who was Guglielma? She arrived in Milan around 1260, a noblewoman, possibly a princess from Bohemia. She lived a life of charity and piety, attracting a devoted following. People said she performed miracles. When she died in 1281, her followers didn't just mourn her. They began to believe she was something much, much more. They started saying she was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit sent to usher in a new age, an age where women would hold spiritual authority. This wasn't just a casual fan club. This was a structured group, and they had big plans. The Guglielmites, as they came to be known, believed that Guglielma would return to Earth, and that before she did, a new church needed to be established, one with female popes, female cardinals, and female priests. And they didn't just talk about it. They acted on it. Enter Manfreda da Pirovano. She was a noblewoman, related to the powerful Visconti family who were at times rulers of Milan. She was also a close friend and disciple of Guglielma. After Guglielma's death, Manfreda became the living embodiment of their hopes. She was declared by the Guglielmides to be their papessa, their female pope. Yes, you read that right. A female pope in the heart of medieval Italy. Think about the sheer audacity of this. The established church was an entirely male-dominated institution. The idea of a woman at its head was not just revolutionary. It was, in their eyes, pure heresy. The Guglielmides, led by Manfreda, were essentially creating a parallel church. They were said to have celebrated Mass, given communion, and even preached, all with women in priestly roles. They reportedly had vestments made for their female clergy. They even believed that Guglielma herself had appointed Manfreda. The group included people from various walks of life. There were artisans like Andrea Saramita, who was a key theologian and propagandist for the movement. There were also other women from prominent families. This wasn't just a fringe group of peasants. It had connections, it had resources, and it had a powerful, compelling belief system. They wrote texts. They spread their doctrines all while trying to stay under the radar of the Inquisition. Why the secrecy? Well, the Inquisition was in full swing, and heresy was a capital offense. What the Guglielmites were proposing was a direct challenge to the entire structure of medieval religious and social order. They weren't just suggesting women could be priests. They were saying a woman was divine, a new incarnation of God, and that women would lead the new age of the Spirit. This was explosive stuff. Their beliefs were meticulously recorded, not by them for posterity, but by the inquisitors who eventually brought them down. In 1300, the Inquisition cracked down hard. Trials were held. Manfreda de Pirovano, the female pope, and Andrea Saramita, the intellectual force, were found guilty of heresy. They were burned at the stake. Guglielma's body was exhumed and burned as well, her memory condemned. Other followers were forced to recant or face harsh penances. The records of their trial give us most of what we know. These aren't just vague rumors. These are documented beliefs and actions, as reported during an official church investigation. The inquisitors detailed their claims that Guglielma was the Holy Spirit incarnate, that she would save Jews, Muslims, and pagans, that the existing pope and church hierarchy would lose their authority, and that Manfreda was Guglielma's vicar on earth, with the power to ordain and consecrate. Imagine the courage, or perhaps the conviction, it took for these women, for Manfreda, to stand at the head of such a movement. In a world where women had severely limited public roles, especially in religion, they were carving out a space of ultimate authority. They were creating a theology that placed the female divine and female leadership at its very core. It was a secret society born of intense spiritual belief, and it cost them everything. But the story of their audacity, their female pope, lingers as a startling example of how medieval women could and did imagine entirely different worlds of power. Number 4. The hidden circles of the good women. Across medieval Europe, particularly in the Low Countries, Germany and France, a remarkable movement of women took shape. They were known as Beguines. These weren't nuns, not in the traditional sense. They didn't take permanent vows. They lived in communities called beguinages, but often retained their property, and they could leave and marry if they chose. They dedicated themselves to a life of piety, charity, manual labor, like weaving or nursing, and mystical contemplation. Sounds pretty tame, right? Devout women living together. But here's where the whispers start. Because they weren't under the strict control of male church authorities in the same way nuns were, and because some of them developed incredibly profound, personal, and sometimes unconventional mystical ideas, they often came under suspicion. The very term Beguine was sometimes used derisively, and they were frequently associated with heresy. So, were there secret societies within the Beguine movement? Or were some Beguine communities or similar groups of lay religious women forced into secrecy simply to survive? The evidence is complex. What's factual is that many Beguines were highly educated for their time. Some wrote influential mystical texts, like Hedwig of Antwerp or Mechthild of Magdeburg, and their independence was seen as a threat by some. Powerful women were certainly at the heart of the Beguine movement. Marguerite Porete is a chilling example. She was a French Beguine who wrote a mystical book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. This book described the soul's annihilation in God, a state of such union that it might be beyond the need for the Church's sacraments or virtues. This was radical. It suggested a direct line to God, unmediated by priests. For this, Marguerite Porete was condemned as a relapsed heretic and burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her book was also ordered to be burned. Did she belong to a secret society? Not in the sense of an organized clandestine club with secret handshakes. But she was part of a network of mystically inclined women and men. Her ideas, considered dangerous, would have been shared carefully, discussed in hushed tones, in small circles. The very act of writing and circulating such a book, knowing the risks, implies a kind of hidden community of thought. The authorities certainly believed her ideas were spreading secretly. The line between an open community under suspicion and a genuinely secret one can be blurry. When your way of life, your spiritual beliefs are constantly being scrutinized and accused of heresy, you naturally become more guarded. You might share your deepest insights only with those you trust implicitly. This could lead to the formation of inner circles or groups that met discreetly to discuss ideas that were too dangerous for public consumption. Consider the accusations leveled against them. Beguinines were sometimes linked to the heresy of the Free Spirit, a loose movement that believed enlightened individuals could become one with God and were therefore incapable of sin. This led to wild rumors of antinomian behavior, that they believed they were above moral law. Such accusations often came from a place of fear and misunderstanding of their mystical experiences and their desire for a more personal form of religion. Let's think about women like Hildegard of Bingen, though she was a Benedictine abbess, not a Beguine. She was a visionary, a composer, a writer, a naturalist, and she corresponded with popes and emperors. She founded her own monasteries. While not secret in the conspiratorial sense, she and her community of nuns possessed a unique spiritual and intellectual culture. Did they have practices or knowledge shared only among themselves, building on Hildegard's unique visions? It's highly plausible. Any community centered around such a powerful, matic, and divinely inspired woman would naturally develop its own internal traditions and interpretations. The good women, as they were sometimes called, or holy women, Mulieres Sanctae, existed in a precarious space. Their devotion was often praised, but their autonomy was suspect. If a group of these women gathered to read forbidden texts, like Marguerite Porete's, or to discuss mystical experiences that deviated from official doctrine, they would have had to do so in secret. The threat of the Inquisition was very real. So, while not a single unified secret society, it's highly probable that within the broader movement of lay religious women, numerous smaller, informal, and necessarily discreet circles existed. These would have been havens for shared spiritual exploration, for mutual support in the face of persecution, and for the preservation of ideas that challenged the status quo. Powerful women like Marguerite were at the forefront of this intellectual and spiritual ferment, and their legacy is a testament to the courage it took to seek God and truth on their own terms, even if it meant doing so in the shadows. The secrecy was less about conspiracy and more about survival, the survival of their bodies and the survival of their unconventional beliefs. Number 3, the Sisterhood of the Free Spirit. The medieval world was obsessed with order, social order, religious order, cosmic order. Anything that threatened this order was seen as dangerous, even demonic. Enter the Brethren and Sisterhood of the Free Spirit, one of the most notorious and misunderstood heresies of the Middle Ages. And yes, women were reportedly deeply involved, sometimes even as leaders and teachers. What did the Free Spirit believe? It's tricky because most of what we know comes from their persecutors, inquisitors, theologians, and chroniclers, who were determined to paint them in the worst possible light. But piecing together the accusations, it seems they held some pretty radical ideas. They believed that through intense spiritual practice and contemplation, a person could achieve a state of perfection, a complete union with God, even in this lifetime. Once this state was reached, they believed they were free in spirit. This freedom had several implications. Some allegedly believed they were incapable of sinning because their will was perfectly aligned with God's will. Whatever they did was, therefore, divine. This, of course, led to lurid accusations of sexual license and orgies, standard fare when trying to discredit a heretical group. They were also accused of rejecting the Church, its sacraments, its hierarchy, and its laws. Why would you need a priest or confession if you were already one with God? Now, where do the women come in? Accounts from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, from Germany, France, the Low Countries, and even Italy, consistently mention women as adherents and sometimes as influential figures within free spirit circles. These weren't just passive followers. Some were described as apostles or teachers, spreading these dangerous doctrines. For example, a woman known as Bloemardin, or Blommerdien, of Brussels, who lived in the late 13th century, was posthumously accused of being a key teacher of free spirit ideas. She was said to have written a book, now lost, on the subject, and to have gathered a large following. She was a wealthy woman, which might have given her some protection and influence during her lifetime. After her death, however, the Church cracked down on her followers. The secrecy of these groups was absolute, a matter of life and death. They met in conventicles, small, hidden gatherings, often in private homes, in forests, or in secluded urban cellars. They would have recognized each other through subtle signs or shared phrases, a secret language of belief. They were an underground movement, constantly on the watch for spies and inquisitors. Powerful, or at least magic women, seem to have played a role in attracting others to the movement and in articulating its beliefs. In a society where women's public voices were severely restricted, especially in religious matters, a movement that potentially offered them spiritual equality or even leadership roles could have been incredibly appealing. If the Free Spirit taught that anyone, male or female, could achieve direct union with God, it would have bypassed the male-dominated church structure entirely. Consider the context. This was a time of immense religious searching. Many people were dissatisfied with the perceived corruption or formality of the established church. Mysticism was flourishing. The Free Spirit movement, in its various forms, tapped into this yearning for a more direct personal experience of the divine. The inquisitorial records are full of condemnations. For instance, the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312 officially condemned the error of the Begghards and Beguines, who are called of the Free Spirit. While this unfairly lumped many Orthodox Beguines with the heretical Free Spirit, it shows how worried the Church was. The decrees specifically mentioned beliefs like man in this present life can acquire so great and such a degree of perfection that he will be rendered inwardly impeccable, and that he will not be able to advance further in grace. What were their rituals like, if any? Accusations often involved nudity, holy kisses that escalated, and a rejection of marriage and property. How much of this was true and how much was slander is impossible to say. However, the core idea of being sinless or beyond law could certainly be misinterpreted or in some cases misused. The involvement of women like Blumarden, or others whose names are lost to us, but who appear in trial records as teachers or holy women within these clandestine groups, suggests a hidden world where female spiritual authority could, however precariously, exist. They were part of a counter-cultural, counter-religious movement that operated in the shadows. Their society was a loose network of believers bound by shared radical ideas and the constant threat of discovery. The powerful women within it were those who dared to interpret Scripture, to claim direct divine experience, and to lead others on a path that the mainstream world considered utterly damnable. Theirs was a sisterhood forged in secrecy and rebellion. Number 2. The whispered covens of the Dianac cult. Long before the great witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, medieval Europe had its own anxieties about magic, heresy, and women who seemed to possess uncanny knowledge or power. While the image of the organized Sabbat-attending witch coven is largely a product of later demonology, think the Malleus Maleficarum published in 1487 right at the tail end of the medieval period, there were earlier whispers and beliefs about secretive, nocturnal gatherings of women, sometimes associated with ancient goddesses. One name that crops up in medieval texts is Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, the moon, and childbirth. Or sometimes it's Herodias, or a mysterious figure called Nomina Abundia, Lady Abundance, or Satia. Canon law, like the Canon Episcopi from the early 10th century, dismissed these nocturnal rides with Diana or Herodias as mere dreams or demonic illusions that foolish women believed to be real. The Church's official line was, "These women aren't actually flying off to meet a goddess. They're just deluded or tricked by demons." But what if some women did gather? Not necessarily to fly on broomsticks, but perhaps to practice folk medicine, to share knowledge about herbs and healing, to perform rituals related to fertility or protection, or simply to find solace and power in a female-centered spirituality. The society here isn't a formally structured organization with a membership roll. It's more about the rumor and the accusation of such groups. When a woman was particularly skilled as a midwife, a healer using herbs, or seemed to have a bit too much insight into the workings of nature, she might be suspected of belonging to such a hidden tradition. If several such women in a village were close, the whispers could easily turn into accusations of a coven. Powerful women, in this context, might not be queens or noblewomen, but women who held power within their local communities. The village midwife who could save a mother and child, the herbalist whose concoctions could cure illness, the old woman whose blessings were sought and whose curses were feared. Their power was informal, unordained by any official institution, and therefore suspect. Consider the case of Matuccia Francisci, tried for witchcraft in Todi, Italy, in 1428. She confessed, likely under torture, to flying to a great walnut tree at Benevento, a legendary site for witches' gatherings in Italy, to meet with other women and men, and to pay homage to a female entity. While the details are classic witch trial tropes, the idea of women gathering, engaging in rituals, and acknowledging a female spiritual figure was clearly a persistent fear. Why the secrecy? If such gatherings did occur, even for benign purposes like sharing healing knowledge, they would have been deeply suspicious to church authorities. Anything that smacked of paganism, superstition, or female spiritual practices outside the control of the church was a target. Healing that wasn't done through prayer or relics could be seen as demonic. women meeting at night in secret would inevitably be viewed as nefarious. The evidence for these Dianic cults, or women's secret gatherings, is found in folklore. Persistent tales across Europe of nocturnal goddesses, fairy queens, and women who followed them. Canon law and theological treatises, documents like the Canon Episcopi, which, while dismissive, acknowledge the belief in such things. Early witch trial records, though often tainted by torture and leading questions, they sometimes contain elements that hint at pre-existing folk practices or beliefs. Confessions, however coerced, women confessing to meeting with other women, to learning spells, or to revering figures like Diana. The term Dianic cult itself is more of a modern scholarly construct, popularized by figures like Margaret Murray, whose theories about a widespread organized pagan witch cult are now largely discredited by historians. However, the elements that Murray identified, women gathering, folk magic, reverence for a female deity or spirit, these themes do appear in medieval sources, albeit often in a distorted or condemnatory way. It's not about a vast, underground pagan religion surviving intact. It's more likely that remnants of older beliefs, folk practices, and women's traditional roles as healers and spiritual figures in their communities continued in various forms. When these practices came under pressure from an increasingly systematized and suspicious church, they would have, by necessity, become more hidden, more secret. Imagine a group of village women, perhaps led by an elder, meeting by moonlight to leave offerings for the spirits of the land, to ask for a good harvest, or to perform a ritual for a sick child. To them, it might be ancient custom. To an outsider, or a zealous priest, it could look like a diabolical coven. The power these women held was the power of tradition, of knowledge passed down mother to daughter, and the power to influence life, death, and fertility. In a world that increasingly sought to control all forms of power, especially those held by women, such informal sisterhoods, if they existed, would have been the deepest of secrets. Number 1. The Keepers of the Rose Code, a courtly enigma. Picture the glittering courts of medieval France and England, the age of chivalry, troubadours, and courtly love. We hear a lot about knights and their daring deeds for fair ladies. But what if, behind the scenes, some of these fair ladies, powerful, educated noblewomen, were part of their own secret network, one that used the very language of courtly love and romance for more profound, perhaps even subversive purposes? Let's call this rumored society the Keepers of the Rose Code. This isn't a society you'll find directly named in historical chronicles. It's a more speculative idea, pieced together from the influence of powerful female patrons of the arts, the themes and the literature they commissioned, and the way women navigated power in a male-dominated world. Think of figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and then Queen of England, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in 12th century Europe. Or her daughter, Marie de Champagne. These women were immense patrons of poets and writers like Chrétien de Troyes, who popularized the Arthurian legends, and Andreas Capellanus, who wrote De Amore. The art of courtly love. This literature often explored complex themes of love, desire, loyalty, and the power of women, sometimes in ways that subtly challenged conventional norms. The Rose Code refers to the rich symbolism of the rose in medieval literature, especially in texts like The Romance of the Rose. The rose could symbolize ideal love, beauty, female sexuality, or even esoteric wisdom. What if these powerful women and the female poets and intellectuals in their circles, like the Troubadours, female troubadours of southern France, used this symbolic language to communicate ideas and strategies amongst themselves. Why would such a society need to be secret? Firstly, any independent organization of women, especially one dealing with power, knowledge, or non-standard interpretations of culture and religion, would be viewed with suspicion by the patriarchal church and state. Secondly, the nature of courtly intrigue meant that discretion was paramount. Openly challenging male authority was dangerous. Subtle influence was safer. This Rose Code society, if it existed, would have been fluid, informal, and highly discreet. It wouldn't have had a headquarters or a written constitution. Its power would have lain in shared understanding, mutual support, and the subtle dissemination of ideas that empowered women and celebrated a more refined, feminized culture within the often brutal world of medieval courts. These powerful women, queens, countesses, and ladies of noble birth might have used the very aesthetics of their time, poetry, romance, art, as a veil for a deeper, more resilient network aimed at navigating and subtly shaping their world. They were the quiet cultivators of influence, their secrets hidden in plain sight, woven into the tapestries and verses of the age. Their legacy is the tantalizing possibility that behind the chivalric facade, women were writing their own rules,